After a whirlwind demo at CES 2025, Alex is back in business to take a look at the very first game with a shipping RTX Mega Geometry implementation, Remedy's Alan Wake 2. Now this promises to bring some of the performance enhancements that enabled the stunning Mega Geometry demos that we saw at CES to a game that already packs some pretty considerable geometric detail. So Alex, are you ready to walk us through RTX Mega Geometry and Alan Wake 2 today?
That's why I'm here, and it's the only thing I do.
Okay, Alex. So what is RTX Mega Geometry? Can you break it down for us, and can you explain exactly what it does and what it could mean for games?
Yeah, so RTX Mega Geometry is essentially a rather large change up to the ray tracing API. So in the past, games have used DXR or Vulkan ray tracing, which used a very similar system, actually. And ray tracing, one part of it is shooting out rays, of course, and seeing if they hit stuff. And another part of it is building this structure called a BVH, an acceleration structure that contains the geometry and all the game doodads that is then traced against. And this building part of it, it's all actually done on the GPU in the PC space. There are commands that have to be processed by the CPU to allow this to occur, because there's always kind of this syncing between CPU and GPU. But all the building is done for this acceleration structure is done on the GPU, and RTX Mega Geometry actually kind of wants to make more of that to be a GPU-driven process. And also it's trying to change up kind of the granularity at which this BVH building occurs. So in the past, like there would be a top level and a bottom level BVH, and in all these little bottom level BVHs, there'd be the groupings of triangles. And that was pretty good for a time when there was a lot more static geometry and worlds were smaller, and maybe there was less geometry overall. But nowadays, modern games have a lot more geometry. They can potentially have a lot more moving and deforming geometry. Or in the case of games that use mesh shading or things like Unreal Engine 5's Nanite, there could be a bunch of triangles that are being added to the frame every single time the camera moves, because there's really good level of detail systems, or there's continuous LOD systems like we see in Unreal Engine 5. And that makes it extremely expensive to process and make this BVH on the GPU. And of course, there's that like command cost on the CPU. So this is an API change primarily, and it targets actually all RTX GPUs since RTX 2000. And this goes above and beyond what DXR does. So what we're seeing here, presumably in Alan Wake 2, is using, I would presume, NV API, but there's also Vulkan extensions right now that are specific to Nvidia. That's the way Vulkan works. We'll talk about this at the end of the video, but this may be a glimpse of what is to come actually for DXR. So yeah, as I mentioned earlier, there's this bottom level and top level structure to a BVH in DXR and Vulkan ray tracing. And actually, I'm pretty sure it's the same in the console side of things. And here, the difference with RTX Mega Geometry, the one that I'm going to be specifically talking about in this video, is the addition of the CLAS, the cluster acceleration structure. There's the bottom level, the top level, and now there's this cluster level in the middle here. And this maps very well essentially to games that use mesh shading and games or something like Nanite, where triangles are grouped into clusters and then traced against separately, kind of. And this is an interesting trade-off because it shouldn't just be taken as a pure advancement over what was previously available as part of the state of art, this bottom level and top level. This CLAS structure is one, it's better for games that use stuff like mesh shading, but it's also just a generally perhaps better thing to use for stuff that moves, stuff that deforms, stuff that levels of detail changes rather often, or things that procedurally add more geometry to the scene, like tessellation, real-time tessellation. And those things previously in the past were way too expensive to potentially do constantly changing stuff like that in real time en masse. And the this cluster acceleration structure is a way to solve that is not GPU specific at all. There were other attempts at this before, research in the past, but that all required stuff that might have required larger changes to hardware and GPUs. And here, this is more of an API change. So it really does actually support all RTX GPUs. And I imagine it would easily support stuff like AMD and Intel GPUs, actually. So that's really cool. And in Alan Wake 2's case, the reason why it is in this game at all, and the reason why it's a big deal for Alan Wake 2 is because specifically in all the areas of the game that have a lot of vegetation, Alan Wake 2 very specifically uses skinned geometry. That means geometry where the actual vertex positions change each frame on the geometric model itself. They don't use like some sort of tricks like a lot of other games do to fake vegetation movement on the geometry. And as a result, it's pretty expensive to ray trace against. It's accurate, but it's more expensive to ray trace against using the traditional way this is done. And RTX Mega Geometry here is trying to kind of make that cheaper, either on the CPU, in VRAM, and also on the GPU. So another reason why this is important for Alan Wake 2 is because it'll technically increase the fidelity of things. Previously, to make the skinned geometry actually run in real time while using the ray tracing functions in the game, they had to stagger the update of the acceleration structure based upon the distance from the camera. So at the origin on PC, it would be 1-to-1 movement, but then it would go down to half rate movement, third rate movement, fourth rate movement, the further away it went from the camera. So technically there could be lighting mismatches there at a distance that you could see in reflections and shadows, and technically indirect lighting. So denoising would potentially also be worse. Now with cluster acceleration structure using RTX Mega Geometry, they actually could get rid of all of the staggered animation there at a distance for the acceleration structure. So it now updates 1-to-1 for everything at all distances. So along with potentially reducing VRAM and having an effect on CPU and GPU performance, it will make the game world at a higher fidelity for ray tracing purposes. And that's pretty cool.
Okay, great. So you basically ran through what Mega Geometry is, how it theoretically should benefit Alan Wake 2, but what are the real-world results that you've actually gleaned from your testing here? Like, how does it actually improve Alan Wake 2 on actual consumer-grade graphics hardware, specifically perhaps starting with the memory side of the equation?
Yeah, so VRAM here is pretty interesting. We don't have really perfect ways to measure VRAM on PC, unfortunately. So this is a little bit of guesswork, but I used here CapFrameX to look at the per process usage of VRAM. And what I found out between the different versions of the game at the same settings, I used 4K FSR performance to keep things just like for like, as well as the low setting for path tracing along with the direct lighting on. I found that it was depending upon the scene, but the scenes that you primarily walk around in the game for the most amount of time, it was usually around 300 megabytes. So like in the town, roughly 300 megabytes saving there in the new version of the game with RTX Mega Geometry. In the forest, same thing. Strangely enough, in the game's intro, which also takes place in the forest, but presumably in a smaller region of that forest, it was just around 100 megabytes saving. So not too much there. Savings in VRAM are interesting because that is actually one of the most expensive areas for ray tracing. It's one of the reasons why we don't see ray tracing quite often in Xbox Series S titles, because the cost of the size of the BVH just wouldn't fit in memory anymore with all the other things Series S would have to do, even if it could potentially have the ray tracing performance there on the GPU side or on the CPU side. So here, just kind of like how you could enable something on the Series S, here I found that if I was walking through the game in the old version on an RTX 4060, which has 8 gigabytes of VRAM at 1080p DLSS quality mode, it would run really, really poorly, and I presume it was running out of memory. But now in the latest version, it's like 60% more performant. It's still below 30 FPS here, but it's not breaking VRAM anymore in the forest, so it can actually run the game well now. And that's kind of this cool transformative effect that I saw so far on the memory side, basically allowing GPUs potentially that couldn't run ray tracing to now run it, which is that's a big deal.
Okay, well, that's great on the memory side of things. That certainly does open up and free you to potentially tackle some content that you previously couldn't have tackle potentially on some hardware. But traditionally, BVH rebuilds have been a pretty substantial, I would say, CPU bottleneck, hence perhaps some of the optimizations that we see in Alan Wake 2. So how does performance measure up here in CPU-bound scenarios with Mega Geometry? Maybe on a CPU that isn't all that powerful to begin with, and might actually struggle a little bit more when targeting kind of like somewhat realistic frame rates, perhaps.
Yeah, so here I looked at performance on a Ryzen 5 3600. It's pretty hard to get Alan Wake 2 CPU limited in a lot of ways, so I had to run the game at extremely low resolution just to make sure. So I ran the game at like really sub 1080p, let's just say. But looking at the side-by-sides, as you can see here, left, the older version, right, the newer version with RTX Mega Geometry, just comes per default enabled if you have an RTX GPU in your system. Like settings here, you can see roughly a 14% higher average frame rate throughout this benchmark, which is enough to get the Ryzen 5 3600 here closer to 120 FPS the whole time. It doesn't necessarily always make the frame times so much better, because that's not the only thing that is affecting frame times here in the game, obviously. For essentially what is an API change, while having higher quality content on screen, like both what the left and the right are doing here is actually not the same thing. The right is processing way more information because there's no longer a staggered update to things in the distance. So it's actually running better, 14% better, while doing a lot more. So that's pretty good, and I think it spells good things for games in the future that have really dynamic worlds with ray tracing, where potentially that is less of a CPU concern.
But what about performance in the GPU side? So we've seen big improvements in the CPU side in terms of quality and performance, I would say there. But on the GPU side, are we still seeing some of those performance improvements perhaps, or does it maybe differ potentially depending on the genre of graphics hardware that you might have in your system?
So here I actually did measure that depending upon what GPU you have, there's going to be differences in how much RTX Mega Geometry can potentially improve performance. Now I went through this really cool benchmark that we have set up by our internal tools, as made by us and Illusion, and running through the benchmark on the RTX 2080 Ti, I saw at 1080p here, and this is 1080p native, by the way, really low frame rates, but I saw a 13% higher average frame rate there on the RTX 2080 Ti. Now, that doesn't seem like much, but this Turing GPU is running 8.4 milliseconds faster in the new version here in this really intensive GPU scene. That's half of the frame time for a 60 FPS frame rate. So it is shaving off a whole ton of GPU time here for this GPU. What that means practically on a GPU like this is when playing the game at DLSS quality mode, as we're seeing here, we can see that it was previously in the mid-20s before primarily, but now it is almost always north of 30 FPS. And this is with direct lighting on, as well as the low quality for the path tracing implementation. So that makes it so that an RTX 2080 Ti couldn't play it before, but now it actually has what I would consider controller-friendly frame rates. So it's basically making path tracing work well on an RTX 2080 Ti, which is a big deal. RTX 3080, going through the benchmark again, here I saw on Ampere, presumably just due to the metrics being different, less of an impact. It was only around 10% higher average frame rate. Still, once again, really low frame rates here at native 1080p, because native 1080p path tracing is really expensive. And that was around an average 3.5 milliseconds faster in the benchmark scene. In game, though, less impressive at like a realistic resolution that you'd use here. Once again, 1080p quality mode. Running through the forest, I saw where it wasn't before, sometimes going down to the 30s. Now it was primarily always above 40 FPS. It just made it presumably a better experience if you wanted to target something like, 40 FPS while playing this game. Now, when you get to RTX 4000 and 5000, this is where things get less exciting and interesting, and I'm not exactly sure why. Just doing the bench, for example, for RTX 4090, it scored only something like less than 1% higher average frame rate over the course of the bench, and that was run multiple times. You would really struggle to see a difference. Technically, there's now obviously, less of a CPU burden, so there's potentially higher frame rates on that end, and there's less VRAM usage. But on an RTX 4090 at 1080p here, I didn't see almost any difference. I also ran it on Blackwell RTX 5080, and they've touted that Blackwell is the best at RTX Mega Geometry. Here, I once again at 1080p saw less than 1% higher average frame rate improvement there by using Mega Geometry on the RTX 5080. And when I went up in resolution to like 1440p and 4K, I actually, over multiple runs, rerunning it multiple times, saw technically a tiny bit less performance with RTX Mega Geometry, something like, like half of a percentage. And you can sometimes see that playing out in the average frame rate counter there. So for some reason on RTX 4000 and 5000, as far as I can measure in the scene I've used here in the forest, where I would presume it would be the most impactful due to all that skin geometry, well, I haven't actually seen that big of a difference here, and maybe potentially a little bit less performance. Maybe this has to do with drivers or the implementation at the moment, but right now, the people that benefit the most from this on the GPU side of things are those that have Turing and Ampere cards.
Okay, well, that's good to know, and that's certainly a very, I would say, exhaustive rundown of the various performance and visual implications for RTX Mega Geometry in Alan Wake 2, which is, like we said, the very first game that features the technology. But that's not all that's new in this new update. There's also some new graphical features, including what I'm seeing here is an ultra ray tracing preset, possibly improves the refractions, the reflections, the indirect lighting, lots of different enhancements on top of that RTX Mega Geometry feature. So can you kind of go through exactly what the changes are there and outline what visual improvements that we might be seeing with those new features?
Basically here, two settings now could be bumped up to ultra. It's the indirect lighting setting and the transparency ray tracing setting. Nvidia says essentially that these are now, for the transparency side of things, path tracing it. And by that, I think they just mean that they're doing actually more bounces there. When you look at the side-by-side between the high and the ultra setting, what the previous version of the game had as well as what the high setting is now, you can see that when Alan, you look at Alan looking in the mirror here, from the perspective of a camera looking at the reflection on a piece of transparency. So it's looking at glass. And basically you can see that you can now see multiple bounces of reflection in glass reflections. So instead of the mirror on the wall being just like this weird chroma keyed sheen, it actually has a reflection on it. So, but on average, if you look at like your just standard wine glass like we see here, the differences between low and ultra are not exactly big. So you would really have to have this thing be taking up a large bunch of screen space and potentially having rooms with like, a mirror funhouse effect where there's multiple mirrors to really take advantage of this. The biggest advantage obviously is just it looks a lot better than not having ray tracing on. For the other setting, the indirect lighting setting, just looking here at this the part of the lodge, I was really struggling without doing, flipping back and forth to see what the difference is here. And it's mainly just potentially better shading and potentially more accurate indirect lighting on some surfaces. It's very small. But curiously, when going to the forest, I did notice that the shading underneath the water, as I flip back and forth here between the high and the ultra setting, you should see that there is now bounce lighting underneath the surfaces of water. I guess that is potentially one side effect of what this does. So it'll make water surfaces look less pure black, instead have a little bit more bounce lighting in them. And that's really about it. Performance, most people really probably shouldn't turn this on unless they really are looking hard for stuff. As always, as I said in my review, the low setting of this game covers nearly everything and is good enough for nearly all situations.
Yeah, I think those settings enhancements certainly are nice, but definitely on the more minor side, at least from what I'm seeing here. It looks like, Alan Wake 2 with the full ray tracing, with the path tracing already looked incredible, and this is just kind of cleaning up some of those like maybe minor inconsistencies you'd see are very slightly improving the fidelity of the ray tracing above and beyond what we already had. But it is great to see Remedy continue to push technology, even with a game that has been out for quite a while now, for over a year. And that certainly is the case, especially with this RTX Mega Geometry technology. It seems like a really interesting application of Nvidia's expertise here that can lead to much more dynamic and detailed environments with ray tracing, which is a great fit for the kind of strengths in theory of ray tracing, right? It's really delivering some of that promise there. And there is the potential for ray tracing with this technology to scale a lot higher, like we did see in the demos at CES. But in the here and now, the quality is higher and the performance is also higher. I think possibly one final concern here that viewers might have with this technology is that it is a bit of a vendor technology here at the moment. It is an Nvidia exclusive technology, but we would expect probably there to be some integration with this technology into the graphics API coming near you, right?
Yeah.
In the future at some point, given how Nvidia seems to be positioning this technology and given how integral it seems to possibly be to some upcoming gaming experiences that might make use of it.
Yeah, I imagine much the same here. Basically, right now, this is limited to RTX GPUs from Nvidia. It's running either the NV API or those Vulkan extensions, which obviously at this point in time, Nvidia is going to be the only one supporting those. But like kind of in the past with when, for example, ray tracing came to Vulkan. Originally, those were just NVIDIA extensions. And then when RDNA 2 came out, there was, the implementation of extensions that were non-vendor specific at that point in time and it changing. I imagine we're going to see something very similar here where most of this feature set from, and there's aspects of it I didn't even talk about, are going to be brought into mainline DirectX ray tracing, mainline Vulkan ray tracing as an update to those APIs so that everyone can use them. And at that point in time, I think we're going to start seeing a lot more heavier usage of ray tracing in games in general, and the API change will be one of the reasons for it. Going back to the presentation that was done at GTC as well as I think at GDC for how path tracing was added to Alan Wake, they mentioned in that presentation that they were kind of at the limits of what DXR could do due to this BVH building being so expensive on the CPU and GPU side of things. It just wasn't scaling anymore. And this is a new lever, so to be said, that could be cranked and leaves a lot of room there to expand, to essentially push geometry levels and moving geometry levels in games in a way that we haven't seen before in the past, specifically for ray tracing. So yeah, I'm looking forward to see what comes next, but this is a pretty cool kind of tech preview. It's really rare that we usually see like the future of potentially what DirectX ray tracing is going to be like now, not later on. So I'm pretty excited. Yeah.
Yeah, that's certainly very interesting and very encouraging. And like we were talking about earlier, I think those NVIDIA demos at CES are still percolating in my head in terms of the quality, in terms of the incredible consistency of the presentation that we saw in those demos, and in terms of the sense that you're getting a bit of a preview of the next however many years of graphics technology with their various neural rendering demos on the RTX 50 series cards there. But I think that's probably going to do it for today, wouldn't you say so, Alex? So
yeah, thank you, Oliver, for being my person who asked me questions for this video. But
no problem.
If you in the audience like this video talking about the implementation of RTX Mega Geometry here and performance and otherwise in Alan Wake 2, well, hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, hit that little bell in the corner, support us on Patreon, and follow us on social media. And of course, as always, this is Alex bidding you farewell und auf Wiedersehen.